Whoa.
Weird.
These are so cool. I can't wait to home make this kombucha.
Welcome back to the Fermentation Adventure. If you are interested in making your own homemade kombucha, then you have come to the right place. Kombucha is a delicious fermented tea drink that's rich in probiotics, and it's become pretty popular over the last decade.
Yes, and when you're starting out making your kombucha, you're first going to need a kombucha culture, and that's called a Scoby. And guess what we're doing today? We're making our very own Kombucha Scoby from scratch. So let's get started.
Join us on this journey to explore the world of fermentation.
If you'd like to learn how to make ferments like these, start now by clicking subscribe and hitting that bell so you don't miss a thing. So what is a Kombucha Scoby exactly?
A Scoby stands for symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast.
That's a mouthful.
It's a very interesting culture. It's symbiotic in that bacteria and yeast work together and they consume sugar and then turn it into this gelatinous mass that looks like an alien, almost like an alien mushroom. So let's introduce you to the mother. Definitely want to have clean hands when you're handling your Scoby. So it's called a mother because it serves as a starter culture for our kombucha. It gives rise to more Scobies, and those are called daughter Scobies. Whoa, that is so weird.
But why would you want to actually make your own versus buy it online, for example?
You can definitely buy these online, but it is so easy to make it yourself.
It's a great skill to have. It definitely saves on cost, and you know exactly how it was made.
That's so weird. It's like an alien.
I think we better get started. You're going to need a glass container, some tea, and some store-bought kombucha. But we're going to get into details as we go.
Now, the reason that we're using a half-gallon mason jar is because in the future, we're going to be making half-gallon recipes. So if you want 1 gallon, you're going to be using a 1 gallon jar, 2 gallons, and on and on. So adjust your recipe and multiply it as you need it.
Our first step is making the tea.
Now, kombucha, for whatever reason, it's evolved to really love tannins, like something really bitter. So what we're going to be using is either black or green tea, and preferably black tea. But you want to make sure you're not using any kind of flavored tea, and definitely no teas that have any kind of oil. Like Earl Grey uses something called oil of bergamot, which might interfere with the kombucha. So today we'll be using black tea. I love this tea.
It's simple, and we're probably going to get the best results with this. So let's bring 7 cups of non-chlorinated water to a boil. Then we're going to add our tea. You can use 1 tablespoon of loose leaf tea, or you can use about 4 tea bags. Now we're going to let the tea steep for about 15 minutes. So let's get ourselves a timer.
Who is that? Our tea is done steeping. So this is the part where if you're using tea bags, you would just take the tea bags out. But since we're using loose leaf tea, we're going to strain this into our mason jar.
But one thing to keep in mind, all your equipment really should be sanitized. So I'm going to put a link to our sanitization video in the description below.
The reason we want to sanitize the jar is because what we've done is sterilized everything. So there's nothing living in here. And the starter culture is going to eat the sugars and then make it into a living organism. So the next step is straining this off. You gotta be careful with this because this is going to be very hot. Don't forget this is just boiling.
And while it's warm, we're gonna go ahead and put in our sugar. We're going to use a ½ cup of raw cane sugar. You can actually use a variety of other sugars, but make sure that you stay away from the artificial sweetener type. And of course, we're gonna give it a stir to make sure it's dissolved. Oh. That tea smells good. Now those sugars are important, like we were saying, no artificial sweeteners, because the bacteria and yeast in this kombucha is actually going to start the fermentation by eating up those sugars. So it's important that we have some sort of sugar source.
Okay, the next step is we're going to introduce our starter culture. But if we did that right now, you can see it's steaming right now. If we poured our starter culture into this, it would kill it dead because this is crazy hot even to the touch. So what we're going to do is let this cool on the counter for a few hours, I would say. Actually, we're a little bit more impatient than that, so we're going to do a trick. To cool this down even faster, what we're going to do is put this into an ice bath. So now we have an extremely cold ice bath. What we have to be careful of, we don't want to get any kind of chlorinated water in here. And then take a spoon and stir it inside, and it'll transfer all of the heat out of the jar into the ice cold water, and it'll cool this down super fast. The cool thing about making a Kombucha Scoby is you just use a previous batch of kombucha to create it.
And if you already have some finished kombucha around, then you're in luck. You can use that. But since we actually don't right now, we're actually going to use a store-bought kombucha. In theory, any store-bought kombucha should work, but we do have some tips.
Number one, definitely choose a bottle that has a lot of sediment on the bottom. That's the most important thing. And if you can find one that has a baby Scoby in it, that's even better.
Number two, make sure that it has those live cultures, and it should say so on the bottle.
And number three, you can use a flavored kombucha, but best practice is if you can use a non-flavored one, then that is definitely going to give you the best results.
So we're going to pour 1 cup of our finished kombucha into our mason jar. So let's get, ooh, did you hear that? That sounded awesome. I can't wait to home make this kombucha. I did not pre-stir it because I want to make sure that I keep as much of that really good sediment at the bottom. Feel free to add more than 1 cup. It can't hurt.
I can't wait to see this thing grow. And kombucha is an aerobic ferment, which means it needs oxygen. So we want to cover this with something that'll still let oxygen in, but we don't want any kind of bugs or fruit flies or anything to get in. You probably don't want to use a cheesecloth just because the knit isn't as tight. The best option is to use a cloth.
Y'all ready for this? Okay, it's time. We are ready to ferment this. Now, there are just a few things to keep in mind before you get to fermenting your Scoby. 1, you gotta keep it out of direct sunlight. That's really important. The sun could kill your ferment and a Scoby won't appear. 2, you wanna keep it in a naturally warm place. So no really artificial heaters that could potentially kill it. And also if it's too cold in an area, it might not really wanna ferment either. So we like to go with somewhere between, let's say mid 70s degrees Fahrenheit. And 3, you wanna prevent some cross-contamination that could happen with some of your other ferments if you have them also on the counter. Because this is breathable and it's aerobic, especially if you have another aerobic fermentation of a different type of culture, they could potentially cross-contaminate. So you want to avoid that.
Definitely don't want a kombucha sourdough. That would be interesting.
That would be interesting.
So typically when you're growing a Scoby at home, we'll ferment this on the counter between 1 and 3 weeks. But we're going to follow this along the fermentation process so you know what to expect when you're growing a Scoby at home.
We decided to test 3 different brands of store-bought kombucha to see if some worked better than others. We tested the popular GTs Synergy brand, the Health-Ade brand, and the Kevita brand.
Out of the 3 brands we tested, the GTs brand had the most sediment, so we had high hopes for this one. We'll follow each of these along the fermentation process to see which brands work the best.
After 2 days of fermenting, we see the baby Scoby from the original GTs bottle floating on top, but otherwise no signs of fermentation just yet.
By day 3, we started to see something new. In the GTs brand, we started to see a thin, cloudy layer forming on the top of our tea. We didn't see anything in the Health-Ade jar, but in the Kevita jar, we started to also see a cloudy layer.
We'll check on you tomorrow.
Ooh, it smells good. And there's a little bit of bubbles. Whoa!
After 4 days, the Health-Ade jar started to take off. We saw quite a bit of white foamy bubbles on top. Meanwhile, the Kevita jar still looked the same as the day before.
After 5 days, the GT's jar was also starting to show some foamy white bubbles on top. The Health-Ade still had healthy-looking bubbles, but the Kevita jar still wasn't showing any signs of fermentation.
By the 7th day, it was really more of the same. But on day 8, the Health-Ade jar looked different, as if the top layer was starting to gel together.
On the 9th day, the GT's jar started to look a little thicker on top. The Health-Ade jar was really starting to look like a Scoby was forming. There was also some sediment on the bottom, a sign of fermentation. But the Kevita jar was the most interesting, with white, fuzzy spots. Unfortunately, that's mold. They were all very different.
After 12 days, one thing that caught our eye was the color difference in the tea. A lighter or brighter color is an indication that the fermentation process is working. At this point, the GTs brand was really starting to get a gel-like layer on top. Wow, the mold spores got even bigger in the Kevita jar. But it's time to throw out this batch. It's definitely not working and there's mold, so we don't want it to cross-contaminate our other Scobies. Ew. And of course now we'll make sure to sanitize this jar really well for the next batch. Ooh, smells really vinegary. That one doesn't smell as much, but the Scoby's not as thick either. And it's interesting how all the bubbles are trapped in the Scoby. Makes for an interesting look. Whoa.
The next week flew by, with both new Scobies getting thicker. After 3 weeks, the Scobies looked ready, but we ended up letting it ferment another week. After 4 weeks, we have a couple of brand new Scoby mothers.
So exciting! Let's take a look. It like kind of burns your nose.
That'll put some hair on your chest.
You really only need 1/4 of an inch thick of a Scoby in order to really use it. But we did get really good success with our GT brand.
The Health-Ade, and wah wah wah. Unfortunately, the Kevita didn't work out. It actually went to mold.
Whoa.
Weird.
These are so cool. Okay, we have these Scobies. Now what do?
You would take maybe 1 to 2 cups of this liquid, and you would actually be ready to make your kombucha batch.
Because it would act as a starter culture.
Yeah.
For your next batch. So this is not the same as making a kombucha. This is the liquid that grew your Scoby initially. This is going to be extremely acidic, even more than kombucha usually is. I'm gonna put this thing back in.
Yeah. Yeah, you would probably only want to use this liquid for maybe cleaning or even cooking like, you would normally do with vinegar. If you're ready to make your first batch of kombucha using your new Scoby, then follow along on our next video and we'll take you through the process.
But by the way, if you don't want to spend the time to wait for this or go through the process, you could always buy a Kombucha Scoby and go right from there. So we're gonna put a couple of links to the ones we recommend in the description below.
Over time, as you're making batch after batch of this really good kombucha, you're going to end up with a ton of these Scoby mothers. So what you're going to do is actually create a place for them to live called a Scoby hotel.
And that's a way of storing them. And we will talk more about that in a different video where we talk all about maintaining your Scoby hotel. And so you can check that out in the future.
Thank you guys so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, be sure to show us some love by giving this a like, sharing it with a friend. Don't forget to subscribe and check out all of our other fermenting videos.
Till next time, happy fermenting.
Hi, little Scoby.
Hello. How you growing in there?